Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. This webinar is being brought to you by the State Federal RPS Collaborative, and that project is managed by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. And our topic today is cross-state RPS interactions, and we have a guest speaker with us today from NREL, Jenny Heeter, and this webinar is being hosted by Warren Leon, who manages the State Federal RPS Collaborative and who is also our Executive Director at CESA. And before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants today are in listen-only mode. This means that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. You have a couple of options to connect with the audio portion of this webinar. You can use your telephone, or you can use your computer mic and speakers. Both of those options are explained a bit on your screen, and you can figure that out using your webinar console. And finally, we would encourage all of our audience members to please submit your questions throughout the presentation as you think of them. You can type them into the question box on your on your webinar console on your screen and hit send. So type those in as you think of them, and we will queue them up and answer them at the end during our Q&A as time allows. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. You'll find a recording of this webinar and all of our previous CESA webinars on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Warren Leon, CESA's Executive Director.
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. Let me just first mention the Clean Energy States Alliance, which manages the RPS Collaborative, is a national nonprofit organization. Works to advance clean energy, and at the core of our organization is a national network of public agencies that are individually and collectively working to implement and advance clean energy in their states. If we can go to the next slide about the RPS Collaborative, this effort is funded by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy, and CESA facilitates the collaborative. It's open to anyone who's interested in RPS matters, and our goal is to advance dialogue and learning about RPS programs. We do a lot to identify best practices, issues, problems, and concerns. We have a monthly newsletter, regular webinars, an annual event. If you'd like to sign up to get the newsletter and the webinar announcements, you could do that at our website, which is cesa.org, and just go to the project page for the RPS Collaborative. If we could go to the next slide. Well, today we have the great pleasure of having Jenny Heeter be our speaker. And first let me say something about the topic we're going to be hearing about, and then I'm going to give you a little background about Jenny. RPSs have impacts beyond their state boundaries, and everybody who follows RPS matters knows that and is interested. How are things operating across state boundaries? Well, what Jenny and her colleagues at NREL have done is collect some really neat and interesting information about the cross-state interactions and where different states are getting the renewable energy certificates that they're using for meeting their RPS collaborations. I think you're going to find it very interesting. Jenny is a renewable energy analyst at the National Renewable Energy Lab, which is in Golden, Colorado. And her research focuses on the voluntary green power market, renewable energy certificate markets, renewable portfolio standards, net metering policies, and utility regulatory issues. She also oversees CESA's contract with NREL and DOE for the RPS Collaborative. Prior to joining NREL, she worked for the Indiana Office of Utility Consumer Counselor, representing ratepayer interests in renewable energy and energy efficiency cases. She has an MPA in Environmental Policy from the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. So let me turn it over to Jenny. As you're going through and listening to what she has to say, please type in your questions and we'll and answer them at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Warren, for the great introduction and for having me on the webinar today. I think this is a topic that will be of interest to folks in the collaborative, and it's a question that we've been faced with a lot. So it was nice to be able to dig into some of the data that exists and compile a new resource for folks. So I'm going to just explain our research process and some of the key results through this slide deck, and then I also have a visualization to show, as well as a data viewer that's in Excel format. So we're hoping those formats for presentation will work well and be of use to everybody on this call. So the purpose of our analysis really, as Warren started to introduce, is to inform the current understanding of how renewable energy is crossing state borders to be used to meet RPS requirements. And as part of this work, we looked both at flows of RECs through contracts and retirements, but also at physical power. So we used two primary methods for data collection to help answer this question. The first approach was looking at REC tracking on the left there. And for that approach, we collected data from regional REC tracking systems, state agencies, as well as utility compliance reports. And we looked at the retirements that were made primarily for 2012, but also 2013 RPS compliance. And many of you on this webinar may have provided data to us, which we really appreciate. And this, gathering all of this data is really the first time that that has been done. So I hope the results are interesting to you. The second method that we looked at was estimating power flow. So for this, we used generator-specific information from EIA, as well as SNL Energy and FERC Form 1 filings. And this power flow estimate is really an estimate. So we had information on contracts and PPAs, but we don't know that those contracts resulted in retirements for RPS compliance. But that said, the two approaches are complementary. So we do know that what is generated from a renewable facility is not necessarily used for compliance ultimately or in that same year. We do also know that generation could be contracted through a power purchase agreement, but the RECs could be sold separately. So these approaches are looking at two different aspects of this question. And as I mentioned, we focus on 2012 in this presentation, but we do have nearly all 2013 compliance data from the REC side. And those files will be uploaded to the link that you see there, probably later this week. So just to note some of the limitations here, the REC tracking data do include actual megawatt hours used to meet RPS compliance, but the power flow data are estimates. And as part of that power flow data, we looked at data on from power purchase agreements. But because of some limitations there, only about 43% of the total net generation from those agreements is reflected in our results here. And because of the way that power flows were restricted using our methodology, there was an additional 5% being excluded from the analysis. So just to say that the power flow analysis is really an estimate, whereas the REC tracking is more of a certain and more precise understanding of what was happening for RPS compliance. And then finally on this slide, I just wanted to note that some of our estimates in both cases don't capture fully contributions from small generators, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So the first piece, REC tracking and compliance data, just some background for folks who may not be familiar with this space. RECs are retired through electronic tracking systems. And when I say retired, I mean that that REC was put in a separate account and could no longer be traded or used for another purpose. So that's how utilities and other compliance entities demonstrate that they have met the RPS in those states. So in the U.S., you'll see the map here. There are 10 different tracking systems, with the New York system is currently under development. But you'll see that the boundaries of those tracking systems generally follow RTOs or ISOs, and are pretty consistent with those power areas. So what was our methodology for the REC tracking work? We looked, as I mentioned, primarily at 2012 compliance, but also 2013 compliance. And the timing issue can be significant in some cases. So because some states allow older vintage RECs to be used, you could, for example, see that RECs that were generated in 2011 were used to meet 2012 compliance. So in this analysis, we do include those RECs that were generated earlier because they were retired in order to meet 2012 compliance. Another timing issue is that some states allow REC retirements for the compliance year to occur after the compliance year is over, for example, in the first quarter of the next year. And in that case, we also consider those to be RECs that were used to meet the current compliance year. A couple other notes about what we include and what we don't include. We looked at all RPS tiers and classes. We did not include multipliers. For example, the incentive RECs that are issued in Michigan or in-state generation multipliers that exist in a number of states. So we don't include those multipliers. We just include the initial REC. And our data sources are listed here, primarily tracking systems, but also some of you folks directly supplied data to us. And then we also looked at RPS compliance reports. And the link is posted there below where these files will be posted, hopefully later this week. So with that said, I wanted to present some of the actual results and just some notes on the results here. We present them by region, and each pie chart will represent the source of RECs retired to comply with the state's RPS. This is for the western U.S. You'll see that in the western U.S., primarily in-state RECs were used for compliance in 2012, and where states were drawing from other states was typically other adjacent western states. So for example, in Washington, you'll see that 57% of 2012 RPS compliance came from in-state. Another big chunk, 34%, came from neighboring Oregon. And you'll also see some interactions between the states here. So when we look at Oregon, we see that they get 58% from in-state, but we're also sourcing from Washington, 16% of 2012 RPS compliance. In other states, we don't have perfect information. For example, in California, we were able to easily access the in-state and out-of-state fractions, but we don't have data on which state the out-of-state bucket there at 28% is coming from. And Arizona and Nevada also were not included here because they did not have complete or readily available data. So when we look at New England, you'll see quite a different picture here. States in New England were using 23 to 65% in-state RECs. They are generally relying on the region for compliance, which is consistent with the RPS rules in those states. And by region, I mean New England ISO. But there are also some RECs that are coming from New York State, as well as a couple Canadian provinces, namely Quebec. So you'll see, a little bit of variation within these states in terms of, how much is from in-state, but generally the New England region is drawing from within the region to a greater extent than the states in the western U.S. In the Midwest, you really see a mix here of in-state versus out-of-state. So states like Iowa, for example, had no trouble meeting its RPS with in-state resources. They met that RPS a number of years ago. You will see on the flip side, Missouri is using primarily out-of-state resources, actually drawing from Iowa as well as Kansas. And then a number of states that fall in the middle there. And the resources here are primarily coming from other Midwestern states or adjacent states, but there is quite a bit of variation in terms of the percentage of in-state versus out-of-state resources being used. In the Mid-Atlantic, we see a similar picture to what we saw in New England, really ranging from 6% to 53% in-state RECs. The out-of-state RECs are primarily sourced from the Mid-Atlantic, but also the Midwest. And you will also see some significant contributions from Virginia and Indiana, which are states without an RPS. So just to note that, when states are meeting RPS compliance, they may be drawing resources from states without an RPS obligation. Other states that didn't really fit into a specific region. In North Carolina, we saw that a little over half of their 2012 RPS compliance was met with in-state resources. And you will note that, the breakdown here is different from what is specified in statute. And that is because the way the statute is laid out, it specifies that there's a 25% limit for out-of-state facilities. You'll see that here we have 43% coming from out-of-state, which is higher than that 25% limit. And the difference is due to how resources that are delivered to North Carolina but not actually located in North Carolina are treated. So that's the distinction there. Texas, we know, and probably everyone knows here, met its RPS a while ago with all in-state resources, and it continues to do that. New York is quite similar with 96% sourced from in-state resources. And then finally on this piece, I did want to just mention that the way small generators are treated varies by state and by REC tracking system, but we know that not all small generators are registered in a tracking system, and as a result, not all of those REC retirements from small generators are captured in the pie charts that I presented. And there are a variety of reasons that those small generators might not register. They might not be required to. They may face barriers of cost of registering or cost of complying with metering requirements or things like that. So this slide just shows small generators that are registered in a tracking system. In some cases, we don't have perfect data. For example, in Regis, there are more than 2,000 registrants in the system that could be classified as a small generator, but those, each of those registrants represents an aggregation of units, so it's not clear how many actual units of small generators are in Regis, but you will see PJM has more than 53,000 generators under 1 megawatt, so those generators are likely fully captured in this analysis. So just to summarize on 2012 RPS compliance from the REC tracking perspective, states on average source 61% of their requirements in 2012 from in-state resources. It's a little bit higher, 65%, if you look at that on a weighted average basis. States in New England and PJM were using greater percentages of out-of-state RECs than states in the Midwest and West. But those regions are sourcing them, according to the appropriate RPS policies. There are a variety of reasons that utilities may be sourcing from out of state, whether it's to reduce the cost of compliance or source from a specific generation type or other reasons. And just a note about California, so you all may be familiar with California's limits on out-of-state RECs, but that limitation only applies to contracts executed after June 1st, 2010. So that is why you see some difference in what might be expected from how the buckets are laid out in California. So now I want to just switch to a different way of looking at some of this data. We have two different options here for visualizing the results that we presented in these pie charts. The first is this visualization tool, which is a file that will be you'll be able to access through NREL's website. And what it does basically is lay out on this home screen the percent REC imports by state. So you'll see the states shaded in a darker blue there have more REC imports on a percentage basis than other states. And then actually when you click on a state, so if I click on Missouri, it shows you the imports to that state on the right here in this table, as well as the in-state contribution. It tells you on the map here which states the out-of-state portion is coming from. And then where available, we also provided information on the resource types that were being used to meet compliance. So for Missouri, you'll see a lot of the contribution is met with hydroelectric resources, followed by wind, followed by a small amount of solar. And we tried to capture, this data for as many states as possible. For some states, the resource information was not available, so you won't see that here on the right-hand side. But the import and in-state numbers are still available. And just to note, a couple things here. We also provide notes about Canadian imports to states where that happens. And then we also, provide some notes, where we had data limitations. Those notes are available on the bottom right when you click on a state. So we're hoping this, this way of looking at data is useful to folks that are, looking at policy modifications or trying to understand, how their policies are having an impact beyond their border. Having an easy way to just click on your state and see the data in a visual way rather than trying to understand it through, a spreadsheet or some other format. The second way that we have developed to look at this data is in what we're calling a data viewer, which you can see here. And this data viewer allows you to select your state here in the upper left, as well as the compliance year. So I mentioned we looked at 2012 and also 2013. So you can just click on those two inputs, and what comes out is the total RECs or megawatt hours that were used for compliance, breakdown of in-state versus imports in terms of RECs, and then also the percentage. We also captured exported RECs, so RECs that we know were generated in Connecticut, but then also were used in another state to meet RPS compliance in that same year. And here's a breakdown of the resource types that were used, the states where the RECs were generated in that export information in table format, as well as a bar chart here that ranks the states where RECs were generated from highest to lowest. So for Connecticut, you see there's quite a bit of information as a result of how that RPS is working and the data that we had. You'll see for Colorado we have the same information, but you'll see there are fewer states where RECs are being generated, and you see that we don't have information on REC exports to other states, so it's just Colorado that's listed here in the REC exports section. So these files will be uploaded to the NREL page that I have linked in the presentation. And this is the first time we've really tried to develop tools like this relating to RPS information. So if you do have feedback on these visualizations and tools, please let me know, because it is something that we'd like to improve upon in the future. So I'll go back to the presentation now and wanted to highlight the second approach that we took to looking at this data, which is looking at power flow estimates. So the power flow estimates have a number of caveats to this analysis, some of which I have mentioned already. But first is that we analyze data from power purchase agreements to estimate cross-state renewable transactions. And as I mentioned, power purchase agreements do not necessarily correlate with REC retirements or even REC purchases. So in some cases there may be a PPA for the energy but not the REC, but we don't always have data on that type of transaction, which type of transaction it was. And to look at this power flow estimate data, we did focus in on renewable resource types listed there, which were generally consistent with eligible RPS resources, but in some cases may not be exactly consistent. For example, for hydro, we set a limitation of 30 megawatts, but we know that there are some states that allow larger hydro resources to contribute. And the data here are from National Energy, EIA, FERC, and other specific sources related to the generation. So what we did for this approach, there are two different ways to look at the data. The first is where there was a PPA in place. So those flows were allocated to the largest PPA counterparty. So for example, if there was a facility generator located in California and we had information that it had a PPA with Nevada, the flow then was allocated to Nevada. And if there was, in some cases, we know that the counterparty may be operating in multiple states. So in that case, we proportionally allocated the energy flow to the states which that PPA counterparty has a customer base in. So this approach does limit the data that we were able to examine. So about 43% of the total net generation from power plants that had a PPA in place is reflected in this analysis. And another restriction we had on the PPA side of things was that we restricted flows of PPAs to only the encompassing NERC region. And so there's an example listed here, but we did that to basically reflect the fact that if a counterparty is operating in multiple NERC regions, it's likely that the counterparty is actually only using that power or PPA agreement for the region, for one NERC region. So we restricted things in that way, which may not actually reflect how energy flowed in that particular year, but was our best way of looking at this data. And then the second component of this is for generators which did not have a PPA in place. Under that approach, we allocated the net generation of the plant to the RTO, where the plant was located. So this is obviously not as precise as looking on a state-by-state basis, but it's the approach we needed to take based on the available data. So as a result, this is showing renewable generation from power plants that did have a PPA, and this is for the western region. So you'll see that on a net export basis, Oregon has higher net exports on the right-hand side there, and then on the left-hand side, you'll see California is negative on the net export side, so it's actually importing So overall, we see California, Utah, and Arizona were net importers. Other Western states were net exporters on a total generation basis. This is the same slide here, but for the rest of the U.S., and I won't go through all of these states, but it was interesting to see that several states which are rich in wind resources, for example, Kansas, Illinois, South Dakota, and Minnesota, were large net exporters of renewable generation. And you'll see those, reaching the higher bars there in blue. We see that, other states, Missouri, for example, is a net importer, same as with Kentucky and also Indiana. So I wanted to give folks a sense of, the data that we have and how that varies by region. So as I mentioned, we looked at, an approach of generators that had a PPA counterparty and those that did not. And this figure shows that that does vary by region on a megawatt-hour basis. So for example, in California, you'll see that in the green there, most of the generation does have a PPA counterparty, whereas in other regions, for example, New England ISO, more of the generation does not have a PPA counterparty, or information on that PPA counterparty is not available. So just to summarize some of the power flow estimates here, understanding how power is contracted can provide insight into how power may flow across states or regions. However, this does not provide a complete picture of how generation may have been used to meet RPS compliance. It does allow us to see which states were net importers or exporters, and we did see that some eastern states rich in wind resources were typically net exporters of renewable generation in 2012. So just to conclude here, and wanted to summarize some of the results and make some notes about future research in this space. The 2012 REC tracking data showed that RPS compliance used a significant amount of cross-state transactions, and on average that was 61%, or 65% on a weighted average basis in 2012, coming from in-state resources. So that obviously varies significantly by the state and region that you're looking at. On a power flow estimate basis, we see similar conditions, and as I mentioned, not all small renewable generators are captured here. So for future research in this area, as I was talking to folks gathering data and talking to some of you RPS administrators as well as tracking system folks and other people involved in the policy space here, these are some other questions that came up that are related. One is, the extent to which RECs from older generators are used to meet RPS requirements. So some states allow, a generator that, may have been built before the RPS was enacted to generate RECs and for those RECs to be used. So there's some questions about, to what extent is that happening, and to what extent are, on the flip side, to what extent are RPS policies driving new renewable generation to be built? Another sort of similar question on, older versus newer resources is related to actually when RECs are generated. So as I mentioned, we know that, RECs generated in a previous year can, in some cases, be used to meet current RPS compliance or future RPS compliance. But we don't have great data about to what extent that is actually happening on a nationwide basis. A similar question is, which states have large banks of existing RECs that they could use to meet future year compliance? So getting an understanding of, how much renewable generation actually needs to be built in order to meet requirements versus, how much states are sort of already there. In the Eastern Interconnection, there are some questions about, to what extent cross-state renewable PPA flows stay within the NERC or RTO regions. And then finally, what additional data sources could be developed to inform and strengthen future analyses. There is an increasing amount of data that's available, but what else could be developed, or what else could be organized in a different way in order to inform some of this work. So these, questions could help understand the impact of RPS policies. And I will just conclude there and open it up to questions. With this slide, I'll leave you with some of the acknowledgments here. This work was funded by DOE's Strategic Programs Office. So we want to thank Steve Capana and Uki Ma in particular for their support of this project, and also want to thank all the folks listed here who provided data to us, provided comments on the draft, and just were generally supportive of us collecting data and bugging you guys for data pieces in particular. So just want to thank everybody here, and I guess Warren, now I'll open it up to questions.
Hey, thanks very much, Jenny. That was excellent, and this information you pulled together is both interesting and valuable. It's also unusual when we get folks sending in questions, and there are a lot of them that I will ask. We also got some people writing in not with questions, just to say, to sort of praise this whole effort. Here's one that I received. This is a great data set, and well organized and well presented. So it really is good. So let me get to the questions. There are a couple about the power flow analysis. The first one had to do with the 43% of PPAs that you were able to analyze. Is there any way you can tell whether your sample is representative or whether there's any possible bias in the 43% you have versus the 57% you don't have?
Yeah, that's a great question. And because we don't have data for that other portion, it's a little bit hard to say whether what we don't have would represent what we do have. But I don't, we didn't get any indication that what we didn't have would be significantly different from what we had. So yeah, unfortunately, there is a bit of a data gap there.
Yeah. And how do you access the PPAs? Are they required to be submitted somewhere?
So the PPA information that we had, we were able to get through SNL Energy, which is a subscription service, and they gather data from a number of different sources, and I know some states are better about others in terms of PPA disclosure. But SNL aggregates that data and provides a data set that allows you to look at a specific generator, see attributes of that generator, and then see the primary counterparty, the percent that primary counterparty is purchasing. And I think they run through actually the top 3 counterparties for that PPA. So we relied on that data set. I do know in California, for example, there is more disclosure about the PPAs that exist there, but unfortunately the way that data is organized is not, was not helpful for this particular analysis.
Okay, and here's a question that was asked about Massachusetts, but it applies to other states with solar carve-outs. And this person asked, in the case of the Massachusetts pie chart, which says 39% of the RECs come from within the state, excuse me, does that include the SREC program as well as the main tier of the RPS?
So for data for Massachusetts, we relied on NEPOOL GIS to supply that data. And my understanding is that, you know, the retirements that are in NEPOOL that are used for RPS compliance do draw on some PV resources, but not all of them. So if you want to look actually in the data viewer, once that's available, we do have a breakdown of resource types that are included. And there is a healthy set of PV that's included in that data set. You know, I know that in some states not all small generators are required to participate in the tracking system. So if that's the case in Massachusetts, I can't recall what their size limitation is, but those generators would not be captured.
Okay. Well, here is another question about small generators. On the chart you showed about small generators, are the categories mutually exclusive? In other words, are units in the category smaller than 1 megawatt also included in the category smaller than 10 megawatts, or does the smaller than 10 megawatt category only include those between 1 and 10?
So no, that's a good question. The categories are not exclusive. So you'll see a column there for generators that are less than or equal to 1 megawatt, which, for example, in Emirates was 240 generators. For the column that's less than or equal to 10 megawatts, you have 446 generators. Those actually include the 240 generators that are less than or equal to 1 megawatt. So if you wanted to see, you know, the generators that are, you know, over a megawatt but under 10 megawatts, you just subtract those two. And, you know, to draw from this data, or, you know, to look at this data, I was really trying to get a sense of, you know, when we say small generator, you know, how small are we thinking about? And in some cases, you know, data for solar generators was available, but data based on the generator size was not available. So for ERCOT, you know, we have data on solar generators, but we don't know how big those solar generators are. So just to say that, yeah, there are different limitations on how you can look at that data.
Good. Well, we'll come back to this next thing at the end, but quite a few people wrote in wanting to know where this information is going to be available. And I will say the webinar recording and the slides will be up on the CISA website. But if, Jenny, you could explain where do people find the interactive maps and your other data on the NREL website?
Yep, so unfortunately it's not up there now,
Right.
but I am hoping to get it up there soon. And there is a link in the presentation to the direct web page. So it's actually our state and local policy page on the NREL analysis site. So if you wanted to navigate... What
we'll do is we'll send that link to everybody who registered for the webinar.
Yeah, that would be great, because it's not necessarily intuitive how to get there. So, yeah, that would be great to just send the link out, and I can let you know when we have everything up there.
Great. So on the maps, is it possible to see imports by state by resource? In other words, how much wind comes from state X versus solar from state X?
So that information is not on the map. The map you will just see, you'll see the imported megawatt hours, and then you'll see separately the resource types used. So yeah, unfortunately that information is not on the map. But we do have some of that data. I know, for example, in New England we were able to get the data organized in that way. So if that person wants to contact me if they have a specific question about their state or their region, let me know, and we may be able to send some of that data. But unfortunately, there are a number of ways you can organize maps, and the way we have data is the data come in is sometimes confusing to represent in different ways.
No, that's understandable, certainly. The next question you partially answered, but maybe you could give a little more explanation, is could you give an example of how you allocated PPAs to counterparties with facilities in multiple states? Was it based on the counterparty's load in each state, or was it based on something else?
Yeah, it was actually based on the counterparty's load in each state. For example, Pacificor is a great example in the West. They operate in a number of states, and they have more load in some states than others. So we allocated the load to the states that it operated in based on the percentage of their overall load. So we know that that's not, exactly what's happening, but it's really our best way of representing the fact that, if Pacificor had a PPA, that it could be used in any of the states that Pacificor operated in.
Yeah. No, that does seem reasonable, certainly. This is a broader question that's not quite as much about your maps, but I don't know if you're comfortable answering it. Are there particular issues when interstate RECs cross FERC regions or major wholesale electricity products, wholesale electricity markets? What happens when a state gets RECs from far away? How do they do that?
So I guess the question is about how that transaction works, or?
Yeah.
Not sure exactly. Okay. So a few states do allow RECs from anywhere in the U.S. to contribute to their RPS. An example of that is North Carolina. So I can work in that, the transaction is just for the REC. It's not for the underlying electricity. And depending on the rules of the state, that REC may be registered in the tracking system that it's geographically located in, and then that REC can be imported into the tracking system of the RPS compliance state. So the REC gets transferred that way. But it can also, just be a REC transaction that may be outside of a tracking system if that state doesn't require a tracking system. And it could just be, documented on paper through attestations that the REC will be transferred in that way. So I'm not sure if that answered the question exactly, but that's sort of an overview, I guess, of how that process works.
Good. Well, there's a lot of interest in your PPA information, and a couple of people asked, will it be possible to publish a list of the PPAs or a database of them, or anything beyond what's in your tabulations in this presentation?
So I don't think we're allowed to publish that actual information, but it is available through Ventex, which is a resource some folks might be familiar with. So I would say, contact those folks, or depending on what you're looking for, you could ask us for specific information. But no, we're not planning on publishing, the full list of all the renewable generators in the U.S. and if they have a PPA or not, or that kind of thing. It does does get quite messy to look at on a spreadsheet basis. And some of that data, yeah, is sourced from Ventex or SNL. So those are good resources to check out if you're looking for, specific PPA information.
Good. Well, here's a question that's not quite on your data, but you may have an opinion about it. When a state with low in-state REC productions changes its RPS to allow more types of in-state RECs in, have you observed any concerns over such a policy change coming from states that have been net REC exporters to that state?
So I guess just to make sure I understand the question, the concern is about, if State A was exporting RECs to State B and then State B decided to no longer accept those RECs?
Well, not as much to not accept them, although that would be a variation on it. They decide to broaden their RPS, adding technologies that would create more in-state RECs, meaning they'll need to import less. Have there been cases that you know of where other states have raised concerns about those policy changes?
Yes, I know that has happened. I'm trying to think of an example, and Warren, actually, maybe you can think of an example. But I'm thinking about, in New England, there were restrictions placed on the types of biomass that could be used, and that may have come up in that regard, that, biomass facilities in other states then were no longer eligible. So that's sort of a variation on that question. That's the best example I can think of right now, but it certainly, is something to consider if, a state is looking at changing its eligible resources, that that certainly will have an impact on, the percentage of in-state versus out-of-state, depending on what resources are in those out-of-state states.
Yes. No, I think you're right. That biomass example is a good one, I think. And I think there have been some cases like that where states have changed their RPS, and it's reduced the ability of outside generators in other states to export. But I think oftentimes the concerns have been raised not by the other states, but by the owners of the generating facilities.
Yeah, that's true, because it's really their primary concern.
Yeah. I think there have probably been a couple of cases where states have raised some issues, but I think more of the time it's the specific generators have raised something. Here's a question. How did you deal with state-to-state variation in what is defined as eligible? For example, in Washington State, most of the hydro generation is from legacy units that are not eligible for the RPS in either there or elsewhere.
Yeah, so there are two different ways we looked at that depending on the analysis approach. So with the first approach, where we were looking at REC tracking data, in that case, when we say hydro, it's only the hydro that was eligible to meet the RPS. For the power flow analysis, because of the way the data comes in and restrictions we needed to make, so we just categorized the resource types that could be eligible. And I think I had some information on a slide about that, but for example, for hydro, we looked at only generators that were less than or equal to 30 megawatts. So in some cases, that may not exactly match what's eligible in different states, but it was our best sort of estimate of, overall what types of hydro are eligible for RPS. You don't see as many issues, for other resource types, solar, wind, landfill gas. You do see some issues with different types of biomass, but in that case, we also took the approach of, allowing whatever was classified as biomass to be eligible when we were looking at the power flow analysis.
Good. Here's a question that goes back to this issue of the PPAs and how you allocated things between states. And this person throws something out for you to react to, and using the Pacific Core example. Rather than using Pacific Core's full retail load in each state to allocate its RECs, wouldn't it be more accurate to allocate based on Pacific Core's REC requirements in each state? PC load in states times RPS requirement of the states. Say half their load was in a state with no RPS.
Yeah, that is a good point. And yeah, it would be more precise. It's also wouldn't be entirely accurate as well, because, the way that the RPS rules are structured, can sometimes allow generation to flow in different ways. So yeah, it is an approach that we could consider. It might just add some complexity to our work, but we felt that using the full retail load was a good first order estimate. So we did go with that approach. And it would get a little bit more complicated in some other regions of the country, but yeah, that is certainly an approach that would be valid and more precise than the one we took.
Yeah. Well, some folks had some additional suggestions for you of other things you could potentially do with the data and other ways to slice and dice it. There's not going to be time to ask those questions now, and they may be too specific for this call. But if those folks want to write to you with their suggestions, they should do that. There's 2 minutes left. Jenny, is there anything else you want to say? Anything you wish you had had an opportunity to say, haven't been able to say yet?
I guess on your note about suggestions for how we could slice and dice this data or how it could be used in other ways, I really would like to hear from people about that. Or if you do use this data in your work, please let us know if it's useful to you, or if there are modifications you'd like to see. So yeah, we really created this resource for you all, and it was interesting for us to see the results, and hope that it's interesting for you guys, and that it is really something you can use in your daily work. So yeah, please let us know if there are other modifications you'd like to see, or you have thoughts about how to present the data or things like that. So yeah, contact me by email or phone is great.
Hey, Jenny, thanks so much, and thanks for being open to receiving suggestions and ideas. The recording of this webinar will be up on our website. The slides will be up on our website. We will send out to everybody the link for where all the information NREL will be posting will be posted on the NREL website. Just note it's not there yet, but it'll be there soon. And Jenny, I really appreciate this. You did a great job, and please give thanks to your colleagues as well. And we'll be back with more webinars in the future.